Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. This is the first video in a series on the book of Exodus, and in this video we're going to read Exodus 1 and talk about gay weddings and the fear of God. All across the United States, many Christians are increasingly afraid to stand with God against gay marriage because LGBT activists have been very successful at creating fear and destroying those who oppose them. Now, there is a risk for us Christians to oppose gay marriage and the LGBT activists. However, what we're going to learn in this video is that we should fear God even more than we should fear the LGBT activists because God is far more powerful than any other human on earth. Now, before we get into Exodus, let's set the background for today's passage. This is a chart of world history. The book of Genesis tells us about the first third of world history. The rest of the Bible tells us about the middle third of world history. And then, of course, we are out here beyond 2000 AD. The book of Exodus, which we're going to start reading from today, tells us about events that took place somewhere between 1900 BC and about 1400 BC. Now, if you go to the very beginning of the Bible and start reading in Genesis, we read first about creation, telling us that God created the universe and everything in it. And then the Bible tells us about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and their descendants began to multiply. Humanity became very corrupt, and so God brought a flood approximately 2500 BC and destroyed most of the human race. The only survivors were Noah and his family, and they began to multiply. And then there was the Tower of Babel, and then we're told about Abraham. Abraham lived approximately 2000 BC. Abram was born in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. This is in modern-day Iraq. This is also the Mesopotamian Valley with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Bible tells us that Abram and his family moved from Ur to Haran, and then they moved down into the land of Canaan. While Abram was in the land of Canaan, God gave Abram some promises. We read in chapter 12, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." This land referred to the land of Canaan because that's where Abram was when this promise was given. God continued speaking in chapter 13. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. So here we see that Abram was promised that his descendants would be very numerous. God spoke in chapter 15. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. So this tells us that Abram's descendants were going to go to a foreign land. They were going to be slaves for 400 years. And God did not say which land this would be. We know in hindsight that it was Egypt. And this verse begins to summarize the events that we read about in the book of Exodus. God continued in verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom Abram's descendants will serve, and afterward Abram's descendants will come out with many possessions. And again, this is a good summary of the events that we read about in the book of Exodus. Verse 16, then in the fourth generation Abram's descendants will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The Amorites were the people group who lived in the land of Canaan at that time. This last phrase, the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete, explains why Abram's descendants were going to be in Egypt for 400 years. The Amorites were sinful, but God was not ready to punish them yet. He was going to give them 400 years to repent, which they never did. And so Abram's descendants were in Egypt for 400 years, then they came back and carried out God's judgment on the Amorites for their sin. So those are promises that were given to Abram while he was in Canaan. Then Abram had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. And at the end of the book of Genesis, we're told that Jacob and his sons and their families moved from Canaan down into Egypt because of a famine. And that's how the book of Genesis ends, with Jacob and his family in Egypt. Now the book of Exodus begins with Jacob and his family moving to Egypt. It ends with the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and there was 430 years between those events, according to Exodus 12:40. Chapter 1 of Exodus summarizes the first 350 years of this time period. Chapter 2 tells us about the first 80 years of the life of Moses. Then chapters 3 through 19 tell us about the actual exodus from Egypt. And then chapters 20 through 40 tell us about the Israelites going to Mount Sinai on the way back to Canaan, where they were given the law from God. So with that as some background, let's get started with Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. So notice that there are 70 of them at this point. Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So notice the Israelites were fruitful and they multiplied. This began to fulfill the promise that God had given to Abram that his descendants would be very numerous. Now notice the major break here. This is something that is in the Hebrew text, but is usually not reflected in the English translations. Let me explain that. In the English language, we use space to define words and to gather words into sections. We have the space between these words. We have space between verses. We also have, in English writings, we have space between paragraphs and space between chapters. In biblical Hebrew, they did not use space. They did not even have space between words. I assume the reason is that writing materials were very expensive and they didn't want to waste their writing materials by leaving blank space. So what they did to gather words into sections was to use letters. They had one letter that indicated a major break and another letter that indicated a minor break. So at this point in the book of Exodus, the author put the letter indicating a major break because the author had spent these first 7 verses sort of setting the context of Exodus, and then he indicated a major break before he went on with his story. So with that understanding, let's continue in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The king of Egypt said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we." Now notice there's a new king, and the new king is starting to become afraid. The new king realizes the Israelites are becoming more and more numerous, and he's becoming afraid that the Israelites are going to become more numerous than the Egyptians and mightier than the Egyptians. Verse 10. The king of Egypt spoke to his people, "Come, let us Egyptians deal wisely with the Israelites, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So notice, the king of Egypt is worried about what's going to happen in the event of war. If the Israelites become too numerous and too powerful, then the Israelites would have the ability to fight with Egypt's enemies in the event of war and turn against the Egyptians. Verse 11. So the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict them with hard labor. And the Israelites built for Pharaoh's storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. So notice the Israelites are afflicted with hard labor. They're now becoming slaves. Verse 12. But the more the Egyptians afflicted the Israelites, the more the Israelites multiplied and the more they spread out, so that the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. So notice that the Israelites are still multiplying, but notice also the Egyptians are increasing their dread of the Israelites. Verse 13, the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. And the Egyptians made the lives of the Israelites bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and at all kinds of labor in the field. All the labors of the Israelites, which the Egyptians rigorously imposed on the Israelites. So here we see that the lives of the Israelites are now bitter with all this hard labor. And so just as had been predicted to Abraham, we see that the Israelites are now slaves in Egypt. Verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah. And again, notice this is the king of Egypt who is speaking. The king of Egypt said, "When you midwives are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." So notice the midwives are commanded to put to death the baby boys of the Israelites. Now, this was genocide, okay? Genocide and infanticide. Now, it was dangerous for the midwives to disobey the king. The king of Egypt had power. The king of Egypt had the ability to punish the midwives, perhaps even had the ability to put the midwives to death. And that's very similar to some of the things that us Christians are starting to deal with in our society, where there's fear of what the LGBT activists may do to us if we don't cater to them and cave to them and approve of their lifestyle and approve of gay marriage. Verse 17. But, and notice the word but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. Now notice the midwives feared God. And because they feared God, they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. Now, why did the midwives fear God, and why did that cause them to disobey the king? Well, the midwives understood that God was even more powerful than the king of Egypt. And so while there was risk of disobeying the king of Egypt, the midwives knew that committing genocide and disobeying God was riskier and more dangerous than disobeying the king of Egypt. And since they understood that God was more powerful than the king of Egypt, and since they understood that disobeying God was worse than disobeying the king of Egypt, they took their chances, they disobeyed the king of Egypt, and they obeyed God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. Now, that's a lesson for us that we need to keep in mind in our culture, that yes, the LGBT activists have power and they're using it, and they are trying to make life difficult for Christians, but we have to keep in mind that God is more powerful than the LGBT activists. Verse 18. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for the Hebrew women are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them." Now, this may have been true, and yet it's not entirely true. This isn't the real reason the midwives disobeyed Pharaoh. The midwives disobeyed Pharaoh because they feared God, and obviously they're saying this, they're trying to protect themselves as much as they can. Verse 20. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, God established households for them. So we see that God was good to the midwives, and notice the word because. The midwives feared God, and because they feared God, God was good to them, God established households for them. Verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all the Egyptians, saying, "Every son of an Israelite who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive." So here we see that Pharaoh commanded all the Egyptians to commit genocide. They were supposed to go out, and if they found any baby Israelite boy, they were supposed to cast him into the Nile and put him to death that way. And then this is the last verse we're going to read today, and we see here a minor break. So again, we see that Pharaoh is commanding the Egyptians to commit genocide. Now, I mentioned that the midwives did not obey Pharaoh because they feared God even more. Jesus also taught that we should fear God more than man, and that's found in Matthew, and this is Matthew 10. The context of this is that Jesus was sending out his disciples, and before he sent them out, he warned them of all the dangers they would face and all the risks that they were going to face as they were going out. But after he warned them of all the dangers, he said this to them: "Do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Now let's break this into two parts. Jesus said, "Do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul." Who is that? Well, those are humans. Yes, humans can kill the body, but humans are not able to kill the soul. And we need to keep that in mind in our culture, that yes, there are LGBT activists who have the ability to harm us, Christians, and perhaps put us to death, but they can't do anything to our soul. Jesus went on to say, rather, fear him, and this refers to God, fear God, who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And so Jesus taught that God is the one who determines what happens to us after we die. God is the one who determines what rewards we get when we receive when we get to heaven. Other humans don't determine that. And so Jesus said we need to fear God rather than humans because God's the one that determines what happens to us after we die. And again, we need to keep that in mind as we consider what's happening in our society and what the LGBT activists are doing. Yes, there is risk in standing against gay marriage and not caving into the LGBT activists, but we have to understand that God is more powerful than the LGBT activists, and God is the one that determines what happens to us after we die. Now, there's also a verse in 2 Corinthians that weighs in on this, chapter 5, verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So notice the pronoun we and all, so that includes you and I. All of us have to appear before the judgment seat. And we're going to be recompensed for all deeds, and whether good or bad. And so again, this teaches us that we need to fear God more than we fear any other human. Also, 1 Peter 1:17. If you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth. And so this refers to Father, God, who impartially judges according to each one's work. And because of that, because God is going to judge us, we need to conduct ourselves in fear during the time of our stay on earth. So let's review what we've seen. First, we saw that God keeps his promises. God made promises to Abram that his descendants would be very numerous, and God predicted that Abram's descendants would be slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and we saw that that came true. But we also see that God's timing is different than ours. God made promises, and it was several hundred years before they came true. And we need to keep that in mind as we read the Bible and we see some of the promises that God has given that haven't been fulfilled yet. And some of those promises are a couple thousand years old. And it's tempting for us to lose hope that they will ever be fulfilled. But we have to remember that God's timing is different than ours. And even though centuries or perhaps millennia have gone by, God does not forget his promises, and he will do what he says he will do. And then finally, we see that we need to fear God and not humans. Yes, as Christians, there are risks and dangers in standing against gay marriage and not caving into the LGBT activists and refusing to approve of their agenda. But we have to understand that God is more powerful than the LGBT activists, and we need to fear God and not other humans. Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. If you're not already on my email list, please go to BibleMountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email newsletter. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.